Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to talk all about presidential elective politics. And to help us do that, we've got two really great guests. We have Professor Will Imboden, who is the director of the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, and Luke Nichter, who is professor of presidential studies at Chapman University and author of biographies on Richard Nixon, George Bush, Henry Cabot Lodge. Gentlemen, welcome.
Great to be here.
Joel, you want to kick us off for our first
Sure.
first incredibly insightful and provocative question?
Well, forget that part. Anyway, maybe I'll start with you, Luke, from the historical perspective. Obviously, this is a very ugly campaign, and the political climate is not the most benign. Is this unusual historically, or is this something that actually has been going on all along, and what's happening now is not exceptionally bad?
Oh, and it's a great question, and there's any number of ways to look at it. I think we are in an unusual cycle, to use that idea, in politics. But it's also not unique. I mean, to give kind of two quick data points. I mean, my last book on the 1968 election also involved a very unusual presidential surprise withdrawal during the race, a vice presidential candidate who was criticized for not winning any primaries, who became the nominee not because they were the strongest candidate, but because it was the least disruptive to insert Hubert Humphrey into what was left of Lyndon Johnson's campaign infrastructure. A chaotic convention in Chicago, stronger than usual third-party challenges, including a candidate named Robert Kennedy, and I think historic lack of trust on the part of Americans in many national institutions. So I think we've seen a version of this before. It seems worse these days in some ways, but we're also not like, go back to the mid-19th century when you actually have Charles Sumner caned on the Senate floor in 1856. So, thankfully, we don't have, mortal combat going on in Congress these days. We have combat of a different kind. So I'm not sure. I think we are living in an unusual age, but not a unique one.
Will, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I would very much agree with Luke. And, of course, the risk anytime you ask historians about are we in a unique moment, we always will want to go back to, well, we've seen this kind of stuff before, but we really have for all the reasons that Luke lays out. There's been, very nasty vitriolic rhetoric in presidential campaigns going back to our founding, right? And the, kind of perversely iconic Adams-Jefferson race to succeed George Washington. We've had political violence before in the 19th century or even, 1968 as Luke has written so eloquently on. But I always do try to think what, if anything, is perhaps new and unique about the moment that we're in, because it is a troubling moment. And I think a couple of things I would point to, which are different from previous times of polarization in civility, are first, social media. It's almost become a truism to lament it, but the way that it can accelerate these divisions and cause the divisions to play out even more at the local level, splitting communities, even splitting families apart, and where the two different sides of the multiple sides almost inhabit their own media echo chambers now, right? So that's somewhat new and unique. And the other would be, and I don't want to overstate this, but we also need to acknowledge it as a factor. The other, which builds on social media, is the new levels of foreign influence, whether it's Russia or China or Iran. And again, I'm not making a partisan comment here. I mean, those malign actors have kind of in different ways supported both sides, right? Their goal isn't so much to see one candidate or another elected as just to accelerate and further fuel and exacerbate the pre-existing divisions in the United States. And of course, social media is a very apt vehicle for malign foreign actors to interfere.
Well, and of course now we can add in AI on top of that. Yeah, where you can look at deep fakes. But beyond that, I've got a question about expectations. Somehow we're, regardless of what the history is of contentious elections and bare-knuckled combat, there is an expectation of civility. There's an expectation in the general society that these elections should represent our better selves, that this is the epitome of democratic culture. And so when it devolves into name calling and finger pointing, people seem to get really upset about that. Is this new, or is it? Have we always had these lofty expectations of civility, or is that kind of new also?
Luke, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I can try. I feel like if I had the perfect answer to that question, then maybe we would find a way out of the situation we find ourselves in. I think, to your point, look at the debates this year. And I think most Americans would say, I mean, the write-up after most of the debates is almost always the same recently. It's not sure any votes have been changed, not sure it really makes a difference on the independent voters. Yet Americans still expect debates to happen. So, so what purpose does it really serve? So I would say, I think you're right. Americans expect civility, but they also expect their side to win. And they expect their side is the right side, and they want others to think the way that they do. And at this point, I'm not even sure what point any continued debates serve, although we expect them to occur. There's more talk now of having more debates, and I've actually already received my absentee ballot to vote this year. I haven't filled it out yet, but my point is the ballots are being set in states, and so much further than this, any possible debate we might have is not going to make a change in the outcome unless we can figure out how to securely change our votes, which I think is an innovation that's probably coming sooner rather than later once we figure out how to do that securely. But I think with the debates yet continue, because don't underestimate the American people for being fickle and for still wanting to be entertained through it all. So I think there are other motivations besides just the so-called desire for civility why the system doesn't change.
And if I can add a couple thoughts again, strongly agreeing with Luke's good insights there. The first is that, my understanding of different polling data and social science on this is that most of the toxicity and vitriol in our politics is being driven by kind of the two 10% extremes, if you will, kind of the 10% of the most politically active and yet most partisan citizens on the far right, and then a similar 10% of the overall population on the far left who are most engaged. And those are the ones who are really at each other's throats the most, and I think kind of driving a lot of the toxic discourse. But the remaining 80% or so of the country, including ones who would identify as strong Republicans or strong Democrats, are not nearly as driven by the incivility. They're really turned off by it. They sometimes feel reluctantly sucked along. And so, using Newt Gingrich's old 80-20 rule of, kind of find an issue that 80% of the country agrees with you on and then push hard on that. I do think that there still is, maybe I'm being hopelessly naive and optimistic here, but I think there is a critical mass, that rough 80% who does want more civility, right? And responds well when they see it. The second point I'll say, and I saw this from having, worked for members of Congress from both parties and then worked for a Republican president in the White House and been a part of a number of presidential campaigns. Most politicians deep down actually yearn for more civility, right? They don't like to be hated by the other side, and they don't really like to hate the other side themselves either. Maybe a few more marginal figures again at either end, right? Usually the ones who go by their initials, AOC or MTG. Maybe, I don't know them personally. Maybe they really do thrive on this stuff, but deep down, most political leaders, and they have strong convictions. I'm not saying that this is wishy-washiness, but they yearn for more civility. They get exhausted by the nastiness and the toxicity as well. And yet there's, with the way the primary system is done, they feel some perverse incentives that they have to kind of go along with it because that's where the most mobilized 10% are. So it's a little bit of a trap. We can recognize it. We can admire the problem. I'm not sure how we get out of it.
It seems to me one of the biggest changes, and, I think I've been around a long time watching this, is in the old days, if you will, the established media, although obviously maybe tended more to be more liberal than conservative, played some sort of referee role. And, I could say, well, okay, if so-and-so is claiming this, well, let's see what the LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post had to say. And you had some idea. And I know because I worked at all three. And is that part of it? I mean, because right today, I don't trust the Washington Post any more than I do the Blaze at this stage of the game. That the partisan orientation of the mainstream media has taken away one of the guardrails that used to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll have a couple thoughts on that. I'm sure Luke will as well, but absolutely, Joel, I think that is a big part of the problem, and it's become this very negative cycle, right? And again, most of the more responsible, balanced reporters for the mainstream media will quietly lament the trap that they feel like they've fallen into. But yes, as different media outlets have become, especially in the mainstream, much more partisan, and all the data backs this up. If you look at party registration or voting habits, or even kind of the skews of stories. Just one anecdote that was a revealing one for me about how some of these big media outlets almost feel captured by their audience. A few years ago, the New York Times had asked me to write an op-ed on a foreign policy issue. It wasn't even a terribly partisan issue. I won't mention the details. And I sent in a first draft. And as part of my draft, President Obama was president at the time. I had some mildly critical words about his Iran nuclear deal, which I would still stand by. And the Times editors came back to me and they strongly urged me to tone that down or take it out. They said, our readers just won't like that. Well, I don't care. I'm trying to say, you asked me to say what I think I'm trying to do. But it was really interesting. They didn't say tone it down because it's wrong or inaccurate or misplaced in the story. It was, please, because our readers really won't like it. Anyway, I didn't change it. They ended up running it. But conservative media could tell similar stories, right? But for me, that was very revealing about when they feel captured, when mainstream media outlets feel captured by their audience and feel like they are almost their business model requires a partisan identity. That's a real loss for all of us.
Yeah, and I would just really add to that my concurrence, but also, for whatever reason we find ourselves in it, we're in an unusually sort of unstable political era. And, you go back in history, I always say it doesn't repeat itself. It doesn't often rhyme. But I do think history does sometimes illuminate the present. And you look at the sort of 1960s and 1970s, every single one of those presidents, you could argue now, with the different kind of hindsight that we have today in this new unstable era that we're in, that every one of those presidents from Kennedy through Carter never served their full term of office as they intended it. Now, of course, for very different reasons: political violence, assassination, being voted out, resigning from office in the case of Nixon. But that's how long that unstable era was. And I think you could argue again that, really only after 1980 did we reach, I think, a more stable or at least more predictable political world. The seesaws weren't quite as sharp as they were prior in the 60s and 70s. And maybe now we'll look back once we have hindsight in this era and say, beginning in 2016, we were in another one of these unstable periods. And I think one of the things that's in common with both of those is that the American people had a historic lack of faith in institutions, all levels of government. Here we're talking about national media. I would add political parties, organized religious leaders. You could make how about higher education leaders in recent years? And so I think we lack the hindsight to figure out our way out of this. I think you look back to the 60s and 70s, we're really crying out for analysis. How did we get out of that unstable season? And I'm not sure, there's not many things that bring together Democrats and Republicans very naturally now or back then. But I think one is to use Will's, 10% or the 80-20 examples, that a sufficient number of people around the big center, whether you want to call it the side of the majority, but the center, and including both sides of the center, simply wanted to turn the noise level down and return to a sort of more normal, whatever that means, political era. And so we are again, I think, in the eye of this storm of this unstable period, and it's not clear how we're going to get out of it.
Yeah, what a perfect embodiment of that breadth was Reagan. Because really, he was able to kind of build that I appeal to everybody approach in the in the wake of that chaos of the 70s, to be able to create that kind of generalized sense of stability. Why is it that that the current political climate seems to be resisting that? Why is it that where the polarity is?
Right. And I would add to what Marshall was saying about Reagan, Walter Mondale. You would never. Walter Mondale was many things, but uncivil wasn't one of them. Mm-hmm. Is there any way that maybe we get rid of Trump? It seems to me that Trump is certainly one of the prime causes for this deterioration in civility.
Well, he's certainly cashing in on polarity, right? This is his
also
point of the realm.
But what do you? I mean, have we ever had somebody like Trump who's done? Would you have to go back to Andrew Jackson, Luke? Or
well, I think Trump's not unusual. What's unusual is that he won, and what's unusual is he might win again. And you hear a lot on both sides of the aisle these days of I wish I had another option. For both parties, that I'm not satisfied with any of my options. It's certainly not the first time in U.S. history that's been said. But I using history, and Will's right. I mean, historians, we can go back to the ancient Greeks here, if we need to. But I think our candidates are a reflection of ourselves, our fears and our aspirations. I think the closest parallel in modern U.S. history to a Trump figure is someone like a George Wallace. And of course, Wallace ran a third-party challenger, certainly wasn't considered by anyone to win in 1968. But I think the primary similarity that I'm trying to tease out here is Wallace didn't create those fears of his electorate. They were already there. He just simply knew how to use them for political purposes, whether we want to label that a demagogue or what. I think that's really the similarity. I don't think Trump has created a lot of the fears and concerns that his supporters have. He has simply spoken to their issues, given them voice, including people who haven't felt part of the political system in recent years, and has taken advantage of them.
If I can chime in here and I would agree with a lot of, again, as always, I feel like I'm being the amen chorus for Luke here, but I'm happy to play that role, right? Agree with this analysis on Trump is as much embodying the electorate's fears as he is fueling them. But to bring us back to a more hopeful note, going back to when both of you guys brought up Reagan. And yeah, this was one of the themes of my recent book on Reagan's foreign policy, but especially as I looked at the 1980 election, part of Reagan's goal, it wasn't just restore the strength of the American economy or the morale of the country or the effectiveness of our military. Those are all there. It was also to restore the institution of the presidency itself. He was acutely aware of what Luke had pointed out, that his 5 previous successors had not been able to complete 2 terms in office, right? Eisenhower's the last time we'd had one. And he knew that a lot of Americans were just losing the faith in the institution of the presidency. The country seemed too divided, it seemed too broken. And I want to just highlight 2 vignettes from Reagan's life that I think really illustrate his effort to restore the unity and institutional strength of the presidency with outreach to Democrats. And he did this as a very principled conservative too, right? But the first is, the man he defeated, Jimmy Carter, consigned to 1 term. A big part of why Carter lost, of course, was because of the Iran hostage crisis and Carter appearing to be weak and unable to resolve that. The day of Reagan's inauguration, the Ayatollah releases the hostages. It's seen as a fresh start for the United States. And Reagan, in a gesture of, I think, incredible magnanimity, sends Jimmy Carter to Germany to meet the hostages when they arrived at the American Air Force Base there. He wanted Carter to go greet them. He thought it would be a nice healing moment to show the country that we're past this partisanship. Carter had a difficult circumstance with those hostages, and I want to show that the entire country, not just Republicans, are welcoming the hostages back. And even though Carter never became a fan of Reagan's, I've talked to a couple of people who were with Carter in that meeting. They say Carter was deeply, deeply touched at that, and it was very healing for him and the country. The second gesture that Reagan did, it's many of you know, when a president is getting ready to leave office, his donors will raise a lot of money because it's private money to fund the building of a presidential library. Right, this was done for all of our post-presidents. Well, in the case of John F. Kennedy, that couldn't happen because he had been assassinated. And in the early 1980s, the Kennedy Library, the kind of fledgling Kennedy Library up at Harvard, really needed more money. And Jackie Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, the liberal Democrat, who was a real policy nemesis of Reagan's, approached Reagan and asked if he'd be willing to speak at a fundraiser at Harvard for the Kennedy Library. And Reagan said absolutely. And Reagan even tapped his own donor base and raised vast amounts of money for the Kennedy Library, again, as a gesture of trying to promote reconciliation, bipartisanship, and show America's commitment to the institution of the presidency. Reagan thought it's just really important that we honor our presidents of whatever party. Again, that was very touching and moving to the Kennedy family.
I was wondering, well, I doubt that Kamala Harris will try to tap her network to raise money for the Trump library.
Probably not going to happen. Yeah.
Well, we can't go there. But that's interesting that you should say that, Will, because on one hand, Reagan wanted to repair the level of trust and confidence in domestic institutions. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, he externalized the enemy by vilifying the axis of evil and the Soviet Union. Yeah. Right. And so that may be a two-pronged strategy, right? Mm-hmm. Historically, when leaders externalize the enemy, it's one of the hidden agendas is to try to coalesce domestic support. And so that if you're doing that together with demonstrating that you've got broader domestic support, it seems like one way out. I don't see Trump doing that. I don't know whether or not Harris would do it as president.
I would doubt it to the extreme. Harris is, and I've written a lot about this, she's basically a tool of the tech oligarchs who benefit from the social media environment. That's what, and they also are, working towards, greater censorship. So I can't see either of these people stepping out. So
actually, I can see that the potential. I can't imagine that Harris believes it's in the vested interest of the country to maintain the polarization, and so there's a potential there. If she's, I think, frankly, Trump's current strategy is to exacerbate the polarization, but I don't see that as a plank in her platform.
I look at the rhetoric that's being used is certainly vitriolic towards Trump. Who, by the way, deserves as much criticism as he gets. She's been trying to sort of appeal to very specific constituencies. That are, using a lot of sort of the social media. I mean, I can tell you, I on one of my email accounts, I get at least 5 emails a day from Harris Waltz. Now, the other thing is she's going to have infinitely more money than Trump. That's just not even going to be close. So I think we have to get past this current crop and hope that somebody emerges even if let's say if it was Nikki Haley against Josh Shapiro, I think that would sort of accomplish maybe what happened when we, after Nixon, where we got finally presidential candidates who were, at least remotely human.
What do you guys think? Do you see any inkling of an outreach, or do you think it's just, as Joel says, kind of a moot issue until the next crop comes in?
Yeah. Luke, you can take that one first.
Yeah, I can start. I would just say, it's interesting. I mean, looking at especially Harris's name has come up a few times, but to observe her mannerisms and her rhetoric, she does seem to be borrowing almost a bit of kind of the Reagan optimism. If Reagan was peace through strength, I feel like there are some days when I'm expecting Harris to say peace through joy is kind of the latest campaign mantra. And I think that captures, I don't know if that comes from her intrinsically or from Walz, because certainly Walz is a sort of descendant of the Humphrey Mondale kind of DF wing of the party, where it's very much based on sort of learning how to disagree without being disagreeable among public policy. And I think that's missing. I think one of the things about Reagan, regardless of his political or his personal attributes or characteristics, is that he had a message of optimism and hope. After this long, turbulent period of instability, where I think the country began to doubt itself, both at home after the experience of civil rights and race in America, but also abroad after the experience of Vietnam, our nation's longest war at the time. Reagan was refreshing for at least 2 reasons. That message of sort of hope and optimism resonated with Americans. And I wonder if Harris is trying to echo back to that, because while their politics are obviously very different, hers and Reagan's, it's certainly Trump is not a person who sort of evokes optimism, in his message. And I think the other thing that Reagan in 80 gave us that we're missing today is, frankly, a decisive election whose outcome that we don't doubt. And I think that's what a lot of the foreign agents who are trying to interfere, besides feed misinformation, which is, I think, one of their objectives, perhaps their biggest objective is simply causing Americans to doubt ourselves and doubt the result of our elections, and sow seeds of doubt about democracy itself and our system of government. So I think Harris might be toying around with those ideas, but I think the lesson of Reagan is it can't be manufactured. It has to be genuine, and it has to be backed by character, it has to be backed by policy, and I think it's too early to tell yet whether Harris can sustain it going forward.
I just, the more I study Harris, and I've been doing a lot, I just think that, her consultants may say this, say that, but her record politically is pretty far on one side, and her rhetoric, even against Joe Biden, if you remember in 2020, was, I think, extremely alienating. But maybe what we really need is a new crop of politicians.
What do you think about that, Will?
Yeah, first on Harris, I will say I'm probably a little more in the Kotkin camp at this point of being skeptical or not too hopeful that she'll be able to be more of a unifying figure. I mean, if you look at her background, coming up in really the one-party politics of California, she's never had to genuinely work across the aisle before. Doesn't mean she
Which,
can't.
by the way, Reagan had to. Reagan was in a very, very strong competitive environment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He had to work with Democrats in the U.S. Congress, and when he was governor of California, with Jesse Unruh and the Assembly, right? Had to work with Democrats then. So, and of course, he'd formerly been a Democrat himself earlier in life. So there was just more experience and intuition on Reagan's part on how you work across the aisle. So I haven't seen that as much with Harris, and so this is uncharted territory for her. But hope springs eternal. If she does end up as the president, and I have no predictions here on who's going to win, maybe she'd surprise us. And on that, I wanted to go back to Marshall's point. Yes, sometimes it does take a significant external threat, and I don't wish any, further ill on our country and national security threats. But Reagan was able to marshal bipartisan support for a strong posture against the Soviets, and he was very clear that the Soviet communism, the Soviet Communist Party, that's our enemy. My enemy is not the Democrats; they're my political opponents, but they're not my enemy. Yeah. More recent memory, and this is fading a bit, but the most recent strong moment of true national unity we had was right after 9/11, right, when 90% of the country gave favorable ratings to George W. Bush, and he really, at least initially, was able to rally a lot of bipartisan unity there. Of course, eventually that phrase and the Iraq War and other divisive things coming along, but I don't wish any sort of ill fate on our country such as that. But sometimes something like that is what it takes to remind us of who our enemies really are, and that as Americans we do share more in common than divides us.
I don't see the way the Ukraine issue has seemed to have divided, particularly Republicans, and then obviously the issue in Israel
has divided Democrats. Yeah,
has divided Democrats, and also seems to have inculcated, even on the right, some really ugly sentiments, as we see in North Carolina and elsewhere.
Or with Tucker Carlson,
Well, that actually brings me to a question that I've been meaning to ask both of you guys, and that is, let's just say that hypothetically Trump does not win. Mm-hmm. What do you think will happen to the Republican Party? How do you think they'll go about internalizing that loss, and do you see a major restructuring? Do you see a major rethinking? Is that actually already going on prior to the election? What's your feeling about the future of the Republican Party in a post-non-Trump world?
I'll take a quick stab at that, but then we'll be eager to hear what Luke says. So the way I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, Marshall, but I don't have a clear answer. Okay, but the way I'll frame it is it's going to hinge on this question: is Trump really sui generis and kind of this obviously hyper charismatic figure of whom there hasn't been one before, will be one since, and the Republican Party itself is more or less fundamentally the same, or has the party itself been transformed and Trump is just a symptom of that? It's obviously the true answer is it's some combination of both, but is it 50-50 or is it 80-20 one way or another? I tend to think, to put the speculation out there, that this is a little bit more about Trump and the charismatic personality, and that once he is no longer active on the political scene in whatever form, that there will be some sort of reversion to the norm of the Republican Party, a little more populist, maybe a little more protectionist, right? Some of those things are not going away, but there will be more room for the Nikki Haley's of the world, if you will. But I've got a pretty bad track record as a prognosticator. I'm better at history, so I may be wrong on that. I don't know, Luke. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, Luke, what do you think?
Yeah. I think. Well, first of all, I studied primarily the 60s and 70s, a period of time that's turbulent, that still is in a way we're just getting to know, with so many records still being declassified from that time period, even though it's been over 50 years. I can barely make sense of the past. I certainly cannot make sense of the present or the near future. But what I think about, this is kind of things I have kind of 3 a.m. thoughts. I think both parties are facing a version of the same challenge, the way I see it, if you apply the lessons of history. I think most of the time, if you show me a president deep into their second term, and you were to ask me, who's the leader of that party? I would say, well, that president, of course. I think if you were to ask that question toward the end of the Obama second term, I think most Americans would say, well, the Clintons, of course, not Obama. If you were to ask Democrats today, if you show me the nominee, I'll show you the leader of that party. Do Democrats think that Kamala Harris is the leader of the Democratic Party? So I would argue similarly on the Republican side of the aisle, that probably since the 2 terms of Bush 43, it's not clear who's really in charge of the Republican Party. Whose Republican Party is it really? So I have 2 other observations. One, I think Harris, I don't feel like I know her very well. I don't understand what motivates her very well, but I do think she's navigating a few pitfalls exceptionally well. I think her desire not to get into policy specifics, to say as little as possible, is probably all intentional. I think Harris is deeply aware of the lessons of history that are really twofold for the situation that she finds herself in. No sitting vice president has won a presidential campaign with their incumbent president in office, except for one example. And the reason is it's so difficult to run on change and continuity simultaneously. Every new idea you have, why didn't you do it already? And every new idea you have becomes separation from the president you still depend on for support, certainly behind the scenes. And Nixon couldn't do it in 60, Humphrey couldn't do it in 68, Gore couldn't do it in 2000. I would say Hillary had a version of that problem in 16 because she was Secretary of State and closely associated certainly with the foreign policy of the Obama administration. George H.W. Bush is the only one who pulled it off in 88, I would argue because he ran more on continuity due to the popularity of Reagan than on change. And I think secondly, the lesson of nominating a liberal in the Democratic Party who runs as a liberal, and those are 2 different things. Even Obama ran largely, I would argue, as a centrist in 2008 who wanted to build bridges to other parts of the party at least. And in terms of a liberal running as a liberal, which I think defines Harris at least so far, you have McGovern in 72 and Mondale in 84, and both of those were 49 state landslides. And the Democratic consultants that I've got to know say when you're in that situation, and especially in a year where the issues are not naturally Democratic issues, which is this year, the economy, inflation, and unpopular war that energizes the left and the youth, instead you move off specifics and you campaign on what Democrats have done historically for Americans, Social Security, jobs, the economy, education. And so I think this explains more or less, in a general oversimplifying terms, the strategy of Harris so far. On the Trump side, I think the real question is, does Trumpism survive without Trump? And what does that look like? I don't know. Maybe it's J.D. Vance, for example. But I do think that emphasis on the blue collar, lower middle class voters that Trump made the heart of his campaign when he formed its nucleus in 2015 is probably going to stick around because Democrats don't seem to want to compete for them and campaign in flyover country. And I do think it's become a slightly more insular, isolationist party than it was certainly under the Bush 43 years. And both of those, I think, are here to stay, maybe not just in the Republican Party, but in both parties.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you've got one candidate who is focusing her campaign around building an opportunity economy, and the other one talking about the lack of opportunity for the people who have been kind of dispossessed. So it's really, that's the way I would simplify what you just said and what I'm observing. I don't know, Joel, what do you think? Is that kind of capture it in your mind?
Well, except that my sense of it is that people do recognize that for her to talk about helping small business and housing, anyone who has followed the state of California during this last 10 years and the politics that she embraces, you know that that's not legitimate. But I think she is taking good advice. And of course, you know, you can always count on Trump to self-destruct. I mean, that's his specialty.
Well, that's what I was going to add is unlike the examples of McGovern in 72 or Mondale in 84, Harris is not running against a popular incumbent president. And that's two of our four greatest landslides in the 20th century, you know, Nixon in 72 and Reagan in 84. She's running, of course, against Donald Trump, who, and this is not meant to be a political statement, who's obviously a much more divisive figure.
So this has been a great discussion, but we need to be aware of your time. Could you each give us a ray of hope at the end? How, you know, can we get back to civil politics as we have in the past? Just to give the listeners something that won't keep them up at night.
Sure, I'll start, and I'll give, I think, maybe even two rays of hope. You asked for just one, I'll give two rays of hope, right? You know, the first is I am a continual believer in the resilience and virtue of the American people. And I want to go back to the 80% I was talking about, right? Is there as a critical mass, you know, a silent majority, but still I think a majority of Americans who may have differing political convictions, but do see our country as, you know, want it more unified and want a more hopeful future. And the second is, and here, this goes back to the post, you know, the what comes after Trump question, you know, speak as a Republican myself, the Republican bench is pretty strong, right? If you look at governors like Brian Kemp in Georgia, or, you know, Doug Ducey most recently in Arizona, Governor DeSantis here in Florida, who I think has done a great job, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. There's, you know, whatever else you may think of them, you know, their particular policies, they are political talents. They've thus far managed to, I think, show a way of conservative governing that brings on board some elements of Trumpist populism, but also has, you know, elements of the more traditional Reagan approach. They're all, you know, relatively young and healthy. In the Senate, you've still got, you know, the Marco Rubios or Tom Cottons of the world. And so I think there's a next generation of political leaders out there who, you know, as a movement needs a leader, right? And if these impulses, bitter impulses of the American people are there, I think it can be galvanized behind a good leader like that. So I'm reasonably hopeful for the medium term.
Last word, Luke?
I would just add to that. You know, you look back at the prolific writings of those who observed the 1968 campaign, you know, you come away with a certain conclusion that the sky truly is falling that year. The political violence, the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of Senator Robert Kennedy, right when his campaign was beginning to peak. I mean, a lot of people really thought, you know, are we going to get out of here? Well, the answer is obviously we did. And I think, you know, I think a lot of the hatred or lack of trust in Trump is not always because he is exactly what his worst critics say he is. It's because he's been effective and politically. And I've had more than one Democratic campaign consultant tell me, you know, we greatly underestimated Donald Trump as a campaigner. We're never going to say it, but the fact is we did. And so I think actually, you know, so much of the discussion around the Trump era has been how it's an aberration, how it's unique. And frankly, I just don't think you need to be a full true blue believer in biblical end times to think that, you know, 50 years from now, we could look back at this time period as we do today at the 1960s, and it begins to look a bit quaint. That the lesson is it's going to keep getting crazier. And I'm guessing a bit of that Trump magic, that blue collar, that lower middle class, that direct appeals, whether it's through Twitter or another platform in the future, I think that's not going to go away. For the most of you, show me an effective leader in the next 50 years, and it's going to be those who consistently find a way to get their message through to supporters, no matter how abrasive they can be, because I think that's the way to remove the filter of the national media, and that's the vision for the next 50 years in politics. But the bottom line is, the sky didn't fall, and we did get out of the 1960s. And I think a sufficient number of Americans today also want to turn the noise level down. And we will, I think, because I'm an optimist like Will, we will find a way out of this, and we will return to a more normal, or at least a calmer political era.
Well, that's a perfect way of.
I agree. I think the new theme is let's become quaint.
Let's become quaint again. I love it.
Make America quaint again.
Sign me up.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has terrific. Just been a wonderful conversation. We're close to the end line here with the election looming, and I can't wait to come back after the election and get your take on it. So thank you so much, and thanks for being guests on the Feudal Future podcast.
The Feudal Future.